data center operators and data center technology companies are moving away from the traditional schmoozing, aggressive kind of sales and are starting to favor hiring more IT professionals and pivoting, retraining them into these business development kinds of roles, largely out of necessity because prospects don't want to take meetings anymore with sales professionals that they feel are not educated on issues that matter most to them.
Joshua, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks so much for the invite, Peter.
I appreciate you being here. So, Joshua, I actually have a big opening question for you right off the gate. So, data centers are powering the digital world right now, but you have started back in the day around servers to work around storage and to work around hosting services. So, how has that changed between then and now, and what is the main overarching trend?
The change has been insane. In the early parts of my career, I actually began my career working in IT while I was still in college. I worked for a national program that was run by IBM to help evangelize early generation PCs and Windows on college campuses. So I got to learn higher education and ed tech really, really well. We did a lot of co-marketing with Microsoft, worked a lot of field marketing programs, a lot of co-marketing, a lot of joint venture programs, was involved with a joint venture between IBM and Sears at the time called Prodigy, which eventually lost a lot of market share to AOL, who eventually lost a lot of market share to when the commercial internet replaced dial-up. And then that led to having a system building business, very heavily involved in small and medium-sized businesses. I worked in enterprise IT in the mid-1990s, primarily in financial services and telecommunications. And it was interesting at that time. We supported, when I was working for Merrill Lynch, we supported about 500 or 600 users in their global headquarters in downtown Manhattan. We were spread out over 3 or 4 floors, and each floor had a computer room. And I was on the desktop support side. There was one person in our department who handled the network. At the time, we were on Token Ring when the rest of the world was standardized on Ethernet, and we were running Banyan Vines when the rest of the world was running Novell NetWare. So yeah, we were in and out of the computer room all the time to help support the networking side. We sometimes used it for storage. There was an interesting name that they had for those at the time. I think they were called Barsky rooms, named after a gentleman named Barsky who won the World Financial Center, which is now Brookfield Plaza, I think, and it's gone through a couple different name changes over the decades. But the idea was that these were set up for decentralized IT. Like at the time, Merrill, like a lot of Fortune 500 companies, had a centralized IT organization. And I worked for a business unit that was strategically important enough, global research, that it had its own IT department. I think there was about 20 people in the desktop and network support side. And then there was another 20 in the sister department that was running more of operations for it. But yeah, it's super interesting with centralized and decentralized. And back then, a fully configured desktop was like running on 386 processor and had like 4 megabytes of memory and a 20 megabyte hard drive, and was very early generation 32-bit Windows. At the time I was there, I remember we went through 16-bit to 32-bit, all these things that seem incredibly antiquated by today's standards. And there were data centers. It's just that at the level that I was working at as like a business unit technologist, IT support, desktop support person, it was more like, okay, there was one person in our department who was involved in the departmental networking needs. And then anything that would actually be run in what would be considered a legit data center was outside of the scope of the decentralized IT. So yeah, it's been interesting to see that evolve. At the time, when I left and went back on my own with a fractional SMB IT business, remote access and telecommuting was just starting to take off. But it was being run over like ridiculously slow dial-up lines, 14.4 kilobit, 56 kilobit, ISDN, DSL. Early on, that was how people did connectivity, with like remote control connections between offices and branch offices. At the time I was building that business, I was heavily involved with leading a user group, a Windows user group in the area. I was involved with a lot of community chamber of commerce types of organizations. So in addition to the best practices that I was building in my own professional services business, I got to know a lot of other people in similar businesses throughout the New York City metro area, and discovered that there was a lot of interesting best practices that weren't being shared that others would benefit from learning. At this time, Microsoft is investing very aggressively in having great channel partner enablement programs and training and certification programs. So I saw that lady was leaving a trade publication that was well known in the, actually still is well known in the industry, CRN, Computer Reseller News, to start up a publication with a small trade publisher out in Colorado that was going to focus just on Microsoft Windows solution providers. It was called Selling NT Solutions or Selling Windows NT Solutions.
And a couple of topics I want to circle back here. So can we draw a comparison between the data centers of the early days, or what were called data centers, both in terms of compute and maybe energy consumption, versus the PCs of today? And then the next step would be the data centers of today, both in terms of compute and energy consumption. How would they stack up against each other?
Like night and day. I wouldn't have been privy to seeing the power bills, but if you look at like what a server looked like in the late 1990s, early 2010s, I think about like the Dell Power Edge, and I think about the processor that was inside of that. I think about the RAM. I think about the drive capacity and everything, and the bandwidth that was coming in out of that, compared to, I mean, our smartphones, Androids and iPhones have had more processor speed and more solid space and graphics capacity for probably 15 years than what was going into a data center a generation ago.
Those are big leaps, and they are also self-feeding iteration cycles as well. How do you feel the data center industry has changed as both sustainability and the clean energy wave has moved across these industries, from transformed them from a nice to have to a non-negotiable part of the whole package?
What's super interesting about that is I'd be like talking to an alien from another planet back then 10 years ago, but now this is the approach that's going to save the overheating that's happening, because the hot cold aisle approach that had been going, that would have been really common at the time, just it's reached the end of its capability as of being able to efficiently cool data centers.
Well, you mentioned the technological aspect of the data centers so far, but what do you think is driving the shift today in terms of regulation, maybe customer needs, or are we leaning more towards the economic side of things as well? So obviously the data centers of today are consuming a tremendous amount of energy, which wasn't the case back in the day, right? How do they stack up?
So what's really interesting is when I think about what's driving the motivation for sustainability and how their company was approaching it. And what was even super interesting to me as well is in early stage companies, a lot of times they're trying to figure out the team, they're trying to figure out the organization chart, they're trying to figure out roles. Relatively small sample size, but in the course of a half and a dozen of these conversations, the marketing leader was also the sustainability leader. Meaning, in other words, like, job title is Chief Marketing Officer, CMO/Chief Sustainability Officer, because they know that a huge part of marketing and communications and messaging and how they're growing their brand and their visibility is very closely tied together with the company's overall approach to sustainability. Around this exact same time frame, I talk with people that have these exact same jobs, leading marketing, leading sales, C-levels, leading product in co-location operators in the US, and sustainability never comes up. Power for sure comes up. How we can get more density, what we can do to retrofit existing facilities, where we're going to build new facilities that are going to get more power, but not so much conversations around sustainability. And the only time when I tend to see the topics of sustainability coming up are when we start talking about external stakeholders. Like if you're a data center developer and you're looking to build a facility or a small campus in the US, most people that have been doing this a while, at least the last couple of years, have noticed that a huge part of that project going forward is how well you do at educating and building trust with various kinds of community stakeholders. A lot of times ignites a bigger question that comes up quite often, as well as a lot of the industry conferences have started to pop up sessions and panels about like, hey, we have a PR problem. And when I talk to sustainability consultants, a lot of times they push back and say, it's not a PR problem. It's an actual problem. They're just trying to dress it up and try to pretend like it's not a problem. And I don't typically like to take sides on these things, but the thing that I've noticed across the board is a lot more companies in the US tend to prevent or censor their employees from being on podcasts and speaking at conferences compared to in other regions of the world. So I think there is very much a concerted effort to try to control the narrative by saying, yeah, we have 400 or 500 employees. There's only 8 or 10 people that have received media training that know the approved talking points. And these are the only people that are going to be allowed to get on stage for a webinar or a panel or a keynote or even a podcast. And we don't care whether they're going on Bloomberg or BBC or CNBC or whether they're going on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. In other words, we don't care whether there's hundreds of thousands of people that are going to hear this or a few dozen or a few hundred. There's only a short list of people that are approved, and there's a short list of media outlets that are allowed to cover this where we feel they're going to be friendly towards our overall messaging. And, that's that. And I tend to, again, see this, it's a lot more prevalent of an issue in the US than in other regions around the world, like night and day. So yeah, there's definitely something to be said for companies that are trying to control a PR narrative, or in many cases, what I call it's kind of inauthentic communications. That's kind of the opposite of what you need to build trust, because they're trying to basically present editorial as editorial when it's more advertorial than editorial, more like paid placements, more paid sponsorship, more heavily scripted.
And where do you see the limits or the borders being drawn between greenwashing and real environmental impacts, right? Because we are talking about the two sides of the same coin, right? And as you mentioned, some people refrain from taking a side, and they know that if we can communicate in a certain way through certain channels, then the message will be most likely positive towards us as a company. On the other hand, fewer companies actually look at their real environmental impact, right? So what is the two conflicting narratives here?
So greenwashing is another one of these attempts to kind of package together a whole bunch of behaviors that are kind of the opposite of educating and building trust and authenticity. And a lot of times when a leadership team or a board is coming up with or approving this kind of approach or putting resources in these directions, I think in many ways it's really wildly unrealistic if they understand their buyer personas. And if they really understood how it's landing with their buyer personas, they're kind of insulting their buyer personas. Because if you think about 10 years ago, it was very common to find that B2B buyers, especially highly technical buyers like IT professionals and engineers and developers, they'd get about halfway through research and decision making, and then they'd be open to having a conversation with someone from your sales team. In the mid-2010s, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, did research with Serious Decisions and Salesforce, and they found that about 56-57% of a typical journey was over before vendor contact or sales contact. So that wasn't too bad. If you did everything right, your account executives, your sales development reps still were in there for about half of the research and decision-making process and could shape the criteria. But when we think about what's changed over the past 10 years, there's all of this digital transformation, some of which actually did work. Not all of it has been successful, but there's been enough digital transformation initiatives that have worked that's changed buying habits. Another huge impact is we have 10 years of baby boomers starting to retire in significant numbers and more Gen Z and more millennials in decision-making roles. And then on top of that, you have tens of millions of people who got super used to working from home and remote work in the early part of the 2020s. And that made them a lot more independent to figure things out as well without waiting for conversations. So that 56-57% number in the 2010s has jumped all the way up into the mid 80s, like 83% is the number that Gartner talks about a lot of times now. For like 83% of research and comparing options and evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room, now happens before they're open to talking with someone from your sales team. And before that, they're just doing a ton of learning. And it's always been YouTube. It's always been podcasts. It's always been webinars. It's always been LinkedIn. And when I say always, starting from like the early 2010s into the early 2020s. But what's changed in the last 2, 3, 4 years is ever since OpenAI and ChatGPT came on the scene and started to get mainstream acceptance. And what was that, the end of 2022? So we're just basically looking at pretty much
Something
the end
like
of
that.
year 3. It's gone from like a science fiction type of thing with ridiculous amount of early adopters to the point where Google basically had this, what they called a code red moment 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, where they're facing an existential threat to their dominance in search engine optimization and search engine marketing and rethinking the whole model, because we're now to the point where all of these searches that used to happen with someone asking questions on their phone all day and looking at 10 blue links and aggregating this together, so much, especially among technology professionals and highly educated engineers and other folks who be all in on power and energy and digital infrastructure, they're not going to Google anymore. They're certainly not going to Bing in large numbers either. They're abandoning the traditional search experience, and they're having these conversations with ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Perplexity and Claude. And if you've ever heard friends talk about that, like, hey, they know someone who's like in a relationship now with the LLM app that's on their phone, and you start to see people like say, well, these apps, as they keep getting better and better and people having these relationships with quotes around them, people envision that like, yeah, there's going to be people in a generation that are going to marry an AI. But all kidding aside, what's ending up happening is these technology professionals, these engineering professionals, real estate developers, everyone that would be involved in the data center supply chain and ecosystem, it's not just that their preference for doing research on their own and avoiding uncomfortable sales conversations and being put through the ringer with prospecting has continued to accelerate. It's that we now find that traditional sales professionals are in competition for attention with the immediate gratification that people can get from the apps on their phone. And the conversations and the value has gotten so ridiculously good that it changes the nature of how companies are hiring. And that's another big trend that I've seen over the last couple of years, is that data center operators and data center technology companies are moving away from the traditional schmoozing, aggressive kind of sales representative, account executive, SDR, and are starting to favor hiring more IT professionals and pivoting, retraining them into these business development kinds of roles, largely out of necessity, because prospects don't want to take meetings anymore with sales professionals that they feel are not educated on issues that matter most to them. So to the extent that they see someone that's working as an account executive or account manager or sales development rep for a big data center operator, a big data center technology company that looks like they could be a peer of theirs because they actually were a peer of theirs in their immediate prior job, that's a big win. And then we start to see along the same lines, a lot of these same people in sales roles and product and marketing roles investing in entry-level training and certification, credentialing for the same reason. So yeah, and we see a lot of folks even on the data center side that are setting up like home computer labs of like little mini data centers so they can get stronger on those skills. And on the facilities, on the power, on the energy side, I'm also increasingly seeing a lot more companies hire engineers for these roles, because when their primary, their secondary buyer persona is someone that's in an engineering role who has more street cred than talking to someone that used to be a coworker of yours. And it doesn't mean that they necessarily need to have been like at the C-level or an executive of that company, but they were someone that could have worked in your department or organization, even if they were doing so at a more junior level, so that there's rapport, there's an understanding of the ecosystem, there's an understanding of what's really going on. So I see that trend where there's a lot more technical hires coming into these type of roles. And I see that in spades with the kind of people that I interview on the data center go-to market podcast across the board. A lot more engineering, a lot more IT professionals, a lot more upskilling. And that's extremely important, because if you want to be able to have meaningful conversations with prospects and future clients, a lot of getting out of that vendor box and being able to knock down sales resistance and get past the intuitions and preferences for self-service and talking to apps all day is being able to look a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, and in some cases, even a thought leader. And I think for a lot of companies, one of the best approaches for that is to insert themselves into their clients' professional development. So instead of allocating 80-90% of their resources to really expensive national and global conferences, take some of that back, a small percentage of that back, and get really good at educational webinars, educational breakfast seminars, and lunch and learns that are hyper-focused on your ideal clients, on your target account list, on your prioritized buyer personas, and taking some of the smartest people in your company and educating and building trust with essentially the people that are going to be on the decision committee. And early on, it doesn't necessarily have to all be people that are on the decision committee, but it's people that are coworkers of those folks, because that's another thing that's been unmistakable over the last couple of years that impacts energy and power throughout the data center ecosystem, even in the category that you're in, is that once it gets to be a significant purchase, especially in mid-market and enterprise, there really is no such thing as a decision maker anymore. There's no magic person, because even if you get the introduction to the magic person, everyone is so risk averse now that they're just going to send you back to their team if you haven't first met with their team and their direct reports and their secondary reports and build consensus. So being able to educate and build trust with multiple stakeholders in a company is extremely important. And your category as well, where you're talking about like balancing conventional utility grid utilization with conventional approaches to backup power with diesel generators and all the other options with alternate energy, whether we're talking about like hydrogen fuel cells or liquid natural gas with turbines, or potentially small modular reactors versus solar for secondary applications. It's super important that prospects and clients see all of the people on your team that they'd be interacting with as having some degree of expertise, or at least being what I call like the concierge or the tour guide of the expertise, where even if it's not you personally, you're the one that's coming to the meetings and facilitating the introductions and facilitating these events. But the best leverage for most people in sales roles and marketing roles and product roles and account management roles that aren't planning on retiring in the next 6 to 12 months is to really embrace the idea that your prospects and clients need you to add value at a very different level than you've added value in the previous 5 years. No one needs you to read the website to them anymore. Videos and the read aloud options and chat have all largely made that a moot point. Even just interactive tools on websites have largely really taken a dent out of the need to see people on go-to-market teams as information gatekeepers. Instead, it's true consulting. And the better people have talked about for years, consultative selling and the doctor-patient relationship. And it's moved from those being nice to haves, is like, if you don't have that kind of positioning, you're really not going to get very far. And your career could be your career survivability for outrunning AI could really be in jeopardy in the coming years or coming months, depending on depending on what part of the data center ecosystem you exist in.
You mentioned so many points. I don't know which one to start with. So first of all, you're really preaching to the choir with the sales, addressing the sales points. I'm actually working as a sales consultant for a number of companies, and I really feel those changes happening right now in real time. And the shifts that you mentioned as well, that you really need to have that technical knowledge, that those kind of subject matter experts on your team, and also on all of your communication levels that are being fed into AI, because the traditional SEO is either dead or it's being revamped on a daily, weekly basis. So it's really difficult for you to kind of get the word out there, right? That you're doing business X, serving a need Y. It's quite tricky. And if, the companies I'm working with, the first question I typically ask is, what happens if somebody types in ChatGPT, your business and the top 10 providers? Are you in that list or not? That's where the show stops in many occasions. And also the second point of the push versus pull type of selling, right? It really went from maybe which ended in the 1990s, that you had the typical used car salesman type of approach, that you just need to kick in the door and you need to speak and you need to be aggressive, from really linearly graduating into a more consultative role and being able to demonstrate the value and kind of pull the attention of your potential prospects in. It really has happened, and I think it's going to accelerate even more.
That aren't there to work the booths. They're really just the captive audience, meaning no one's going to pay to sponsor that event or exhibit at that event if there's no audience. No one's coming to speak at that event. Usually there's no speaking fee, so they're basically providing public speaking in return for getting access to. No one's going to do that if the 80% of the folks aren't there that are actually the product. So it's a different way of looking at this, but what tends to happen is when people are overweighting their investments in these kinds of environments, it's usually because of the sheer numbers, as they love the idea of getting in front of thousands of people at once. The reality, though, is if they look really carefully at the demographics who's attending each show, there's some shows that could be a really good fit for them, and there's some shows that could be a terrible fit. I usually say take a real simple approach of looking at the media kit, the prospectus, whether it's a nice portal site or a PDF or whatever it is, put that on one side of the screen and bring up your ideal client profile and your buyer personas on the other side of the screen. And if it matches up really well, that's a good show. If it doesn't match up really well, that's probably not the best use of your efforts. if you're counting on a needle in a haystack. The interesting part with running your own events is you get to decide exactly who gets invited. It's people that are on your target account list and you prioritize buyer personas. So you don't have a big loss factor on the percentage of people that are qualified versus non-qualified. You get to decide the timing. You get to decide the topics. It's all within your control. It's a big mindset change, though, for a lot of companies that chase these vanity metrics, that think they need to be in front of thousands of people and hope that they get a few minutes with the right person in this massively competitive conference environment where everyone wants a couple minutes with the magic person. But the reality is, in order to build consensus across multiple stakeholders from the company, you need a lot more session time. You need a lot more minutes of watch time if you want to look at like the metrics that people look at with like webinars and like YouTube videos. But at the end of the day, if you can get multiple people from the same company coming month after month to a 10 or 12 part breakfast seminar, lunch and learn series, webinar series, that's exactly for that kind of stakeholder in that geographic region of a company roughly that size in that industry. And the know, like, and trust is accelerated because you've brought some of the smartest people from your company in to teach amazing world-class content. And it's super participatory because it's in your conference room or classroom. There's only 20, 30 people in the room, starting to really, really influence how they navigate all the different options that are in your category, exposing them to your best practices and your methodologies. They're going to start quoting you as they go back to their internal team members. You'll start to notice that as you get to the second or the third or the fourth or fifth part in this monthly series, that you start to see bigger groups coming from the same companies. So they're saying, hey, this Bob, Susan, this breakfast seminar is amazing. You got to come to the next one. And then that's how you start to get critical mass and improving the surface area and getting to meet the decision committee and really, really shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate this kind of category. And especially in something that's as rapidly emerging as alternate energy, and where there's so many people that are concerned about, like, when they just go to the shows, that it's overhyped and greenwashing, and are they really getting the scoop? And no, they don't want to spend the time interacting with people that are just dumping hype on them. They want to be learning from the engineers and from the facilities managers and the product developers that are building these transformative technologies.
So what's the solution? You need to pick smaller, more targeted events with your buyer personas, and you really need to showcase that you're the best of breed in the market, and then hopefully you will get some good leads on the back of it.
Your CFOs and your board should love it as well, because if you look at a company that has a medium-size exhibit presence at a national or global show, by the time they get done paying for the booth, paying for the swag, paying for all the collateral, paying for travel expenses for a minimum of 5-6 people to staff that booth, these investments start to get into like the $100,000, 100,000 euros, 100,000 pound kind of range very, very quickly. And if you do this several times a year, because the shows are so fragmented in their reach, it can get crazy expensive. The cost of running your own events is like the exact opposite. If you're a data center operator and you have a classroom or a conference room, or you do something related to facilities or energy, and you have a classroom or conference room in your own facility, essentially the cost of you renting that room is basically zero. There could be some like wonky internal chargeback mechanism between the facilities part of your company and the sales, the marketing organization, but for the most part, it's pretty close to zero. Most companies that are focused on field marketing and event marketing and account-based marketing already have a CRM system. They already have an email marketing program in place. So the idea of like putting up a landing page to promote, whether it's webinars or whether it's in-person events, again, it's work. You need good buyer persona research, good landing page copywriting, good execution. But compared to the work and the expense that goes into a national or global conference, very close to zero. If you haven't built that list in the past, you probably want to do some outbound emails. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn Campaign Manager, LinkedIn Ads, as long as the unit economics are. So that's really the only place that you might end up spending a little bit on promotion if you don't have a good, highly targeted email list that you have a good relationship with already. And then the only other cost is like if you're having a breakfast or lunch event, like minimal, like what does it cost to bring in bagels and fruit and pastries and coffee for a breakfast event, or bring in pizza or sandwiches or salads or something like that for lunch? This is something that for 15 or 20 people is a few $100s compared to the cost of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to a global conference. And you don't have the loss factor. because the only people that are getting invited work for companies that are on your target account list, and they're in these job roles that are in the target account list. And the only thing that people sometimes need a little bit of expectations management about is, from our perspective, if it's the right company and it's the right job role, sure, you'd like to have the VP or the CTO or someone like that attending, but I'm perfectly at peace if someone that's fairly entry level or like a senior individual contributor or something like that is the one that's initially attending, because if they get good value next time around when they register and they get back the email that says, hey, we're so glad to see that you registered for our Power Sustainability for Mid-Market Manufacturing Executives breakfast seminar that's coming up. But we know it takes a village. There's typically people involved from engineering and finance and compliance and ESG. So with that in mind, who else from your team or from other teams in your company would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button on your email message. And we know the teams that learn together grow together. And when you start to look at your registration list, you're like, whoa, that worked. Out of the 20 people that are in the room, there's 3 little clusters of 2 to 4 people from the same company. They're talking about us. We're proactively driving alignment. This is the magic that people need to start to get significantly qualified opportunities on their board. And it's the right companies over time. As you start to win over more stakeholders and they see that you have some super smart people on your company, in that category, and that you're really down to earth and easy to work with, it starts to plant the seeds for like, yeah, we totally should be working with this. So like the format I always tell people is they register for an in-person event, they register, have a little bit of networking, they have some breakfast or lunch, the 30 or 40 minutes for the actual program. And it needs to be educational. It needs to be so good that you're highly confident that presentation, the slides, that if you went to a national or global conference, that you're super confident you'd have one of the highest rated sessions of the entire conference. It needs to be like world-class educational, small group. So whoever is giving the talk should be try to make it as interactive and participatory as possible, so they get to know the people in the rooms. For sure, at the end, have some Q&A. And then for whoever wants to stick around, they can come and see the demo. In the case of like a data center operator, take the tour is always the most natural step. In your category, it's probably taking them to the warehouse or the shop and giving them some kind of demonstration of how the equipment works. If that's not equipment that can be brought into the main room where you're giving the talk, and do that repeatedly. Just simply lather, rinse, and repeat. It really, really makes an enormous difference to your sales team being seen a lot more like professional development and learning and development, as opposed to a vendor that's just trying to sell something and make a quota. And that's the unlock with all of this. And if you're fortunate enough that you have members of your sales team that are technical enough that they can deliver this kind of content, that's great. If not, then you bring in your sales engineers, you bring in your solutions engineers, you bring in your product manager, you bring in whoever you need to that does have that background, that does have that credibility, that can be the speaker, the subject matter expert. And if you have those 10 or 12 topics that come right out of your buyer personas over the course of the year, and you get to the point where you've covered half or 2/3 of them with internal experts and you've exhausted your internal experts, not because they're not willing. That's a whole separate problem, by the way, also. And a lot of times you need executive sponsorship in a small company coming all the way down from your CEO to say that this is super important. It's really important because our team is getting treated like crap by a lot of prospects and clients. They're ghosting us. They're condescending. They don't realize that we have some of the most brilliant people and the best technologies and the best value on the planet. We're tired of being this big secret. So we need to get out in front and let the industry know who we are, what we bring to the table, and why we're the best option that's out there. So a lot of times needs to start all the way up. But as long as there's that C-level buy-in and there's alignment, and once you've exhausted your internal subject matter experts, then you go to your contractors, you go to your channel partners, you could bring in clients and moderate panels. But at the end of the day, it's about really understanding for those 2 or 3 or 4 really important buyer personas, your primary, your secondary buyer persona, any tertiary buyer personas. What are the 5 or 6 big goals that they're working on individually, as a team, as a company? The goals tend to show up in their job descriptions. It shows up in how they describe what they do for their job on their LinkedIn summaries, on their LinkedIn about us. It for sure shows up in their objectives and key results. It's just that early on, when they're strangers and you don't have a great insider track on what's going on in their lives, you can't exactly call up a prospect and say, tell me about your OKRs. They will over time as you get to know them better. They'll share exactly what they're working on and what they need to accomplish. But early on, when they're strangers, at least you can do your normal buyer persona research to figure that out. And then what they're struggling with the most on the other side. I always say, like, if I was building go-to-market for a company that was in solar energy with a data center, I'd be like, what's your biggest data center power challenge? What's your biggest data center energy challenge that you're going through right now? And I'd get the answers in their own words. And it's great for your account executives and sales development reps because that's now sitting in the CRM, so you can customize all your outreach. It's great when you aggregate that data across a handful of people from that same company. So you can see if they're all saying the same things or if they're all say different kinds of things. And when then you aggregate the whole segment together, like a couple dozen or a couple hundred votes or a couple thousand votes across that buyer persona, you can pretty quickly see, like, in their own words, what is that persona struggling with the most in descending order of frequency, and the same thing with their goals. And those 10 or 12 goals and challenges is exactly the 10 or 12 topics to use in their own words for your event schedule. And if they can't get there easily to your facility, or you don't have a facility, that's your 10 or 12 monthly webinars. If you can even better host these events in person, those are your 10 or 12 in-person events. Record all of them, repurpose them. There's always going to be people that say, oh, my boss should have been here. My engineer should have been here. My CFO should have been here. Can I get the slides? Even better, I'll give you the slides and a recording, and you can repurpose it a lot of different ways. But yeah, that's the big unlock with all of this, is educating and building trust and being seen a lot more like learning and development and professional development with educational experiences that are so good that it's at least as good as what they would get from going to a national or global conference. But you're winning over by convenience and relevancy. It's so much more specific to who they are. And if you happen to have good geographic proximity in person, if not, webinars.
Makes sense. So basically, people should focus more on smaller targeted events than an RE Plus or an Intersolar in Munich, and hopefully they should see better returns, right?
Yeah, much better. And I would say that for any company, for starters, if you have good segmentation already, and you know, for example, like in your category, maybe you're selling to a director of data center development, and then there's also an ESG person, and there's also a finance person, maybe there's also channel partners. Those 3 or 4 different segments are going to have different goals and challenges. I would strongly argue for taking that customer insight research, and they at least get their own page on your website for who we help. They should at least have their own premium content lead generation offer, and they should have their own event series. Because when it's that inexpensive to host these own events, what I'd recommend is the first Wednesday of the month, or whatever works out for you and them for timing, is all about your primary, in which case maybe it's the VP of data center development. Maybe the secondary is the ESG person or director of energy management or whatever it is. And I would segment out the events so that you can be ridiculously specific in the event titles and in the headline and the messaging, so you really, really nail relevance. And on top of that, makes your perceived value, it eliminates so much of the competition, because all of a sudden you're operating at so much more of a specific level that not only keeping you on the short list, but starts to really neutralize other competitive options that are on the short list, because they see that you're so hyper relevant to who they are and what they do. Yeah, and run those on a repeated cycle. Typically, in most considered buyers' journeys today, 25 to 30 different touch points that they'll interact with between complete stranger and purchase decision. My goal for most companies is for you to monopolize those 28, 25 touch points. And if you can start by getting them to spend an hour with you once a month, that's making a really, really good dent in overwhelming and controlling the surface area for that research and decision-making process that they're going to go through in your category. And over time, you'll continue to iterate this, because every time you have another person that fills out a landing page form for premium content or registers for one of your events, you're constantly asking, like, what's your biggest power struggle? What's your biggest question about alternate energy? Whatever your category is. And over time, you'll have more and more of these votes. You'll discover more and more of these topics, and you'll continue to improve on this. And this feeds not only your event strategy, but feeds what you do with email marketing, your newsletters, your social posts, your ads, your messaging. Really, at this stage of the game, companies that are looking to improve the performance of their website should really start with making sure that they're using the exact words that their most important personas use, and not just guessing, because that alone can make an enormous difference no matter how you're driving the traffic to there. But in your category specifically, where there's something physical that you're always going to want to demonstrate, the in-person event is always going to win over the virtual event or win over the YouTube video. So the better job you can do with getting the right people to attend and they shouldn't perceive it as an infomercial. It shouldn't be perceived as overly salesy. I would argue that in a 90-minute event, no more than 10 to 15 minutes of it should talk about your product and your company. Nearly all of it should be talking about best practices of how others approach this particular goal or this particular challenge that helps them do their job better. That alone can win over enormous amounts of relationship equity that gets those folks to start to advocate for you within their teams with their coworkers. It's all trust. That's the big thing that everyone's battling for. Like when you mentioned before, like it used to be that people were trying to figure out search engine optimization so they could be above the fold. So they played games with like link building and topical authority and content clusters. And that's still certainly something that people are spending time, and then search engine marketing to buy their way in with things like Google Ads, Google AdWords, what used to be known as Google AdWords, what's today known as Google. All of this is going to reinvent itself to morph into these new experiences that people are craving on the GPT apps. But at the end of the day, what's going to get recommended is relevancy and trust. So the better job you can do of having the large language models see you as a trustworthy, authoritative source on a topic, the more likely it is that you're going to be recommended. Without that, you're just going to be invisible. For a lot of companies that have lamented the loss of organic search traffic, what I've been telling people for the better part of a year or two right now is really step on the gas with what you're doing with YouTube, because Alphabet has billions, trillions potentially riding on the line with the transition from traditional search over to YouTube. And YouTube's largely going to be the engine that feeds a lot of the data that goes into Gemini. Like, yeah, there's a lot to be said for having a tremendous amount of topical authority, kind of saturation of everywhere they look on your topic and all the adjacent topics that are highly relevant to them. They keep finding super helpful, educational, how-to kind of content, panels, podcasts, interviews, webinars, exactly what we're doing, which it's really interesting, as well as I've been telling people too that sell to mid-market and enterprise. If you have large unit economics, meaning that your teams are selling like 6-figure, 7-figure kinds of deals, pretty much every team, every pod should have something like this. It is by far and away the most effective way to get your prospects and clients to see your product managers, to see your account executives, to see your account managers as experts when they're the ones that are hosting these great educational conversations on a very, very regular basis. And like I mentioned, that the research before from Edelman and LinkedIn, your prospects are going to be 95% more likely to be receptive to your outbound when they see you as a thought leader, as opposed to just a pushy account executive or sales development rep.
I mean, that's one of the main motivations behind this podcast as well. You know, back in the day when I started in solar, I was looking through a lot of resources, how to get up and running really quickly and go deep into the EPC and the solar engineering topics. And there wasn't much out there. You know, you could find a couple of videos here and there. The only podcast that I was following, and I'm still following, is My Suncast by Nico Johnson. But other than that, you know, you didn't really have too much collateral. And that's one of the main reasons why I decided to start this one, to kind of dig into the intersection of business and solar, and also business and renewables, and trying to make sense of it all. And it's really enriching and also highly productive on the networking side of things to meet people like yourself who are at the top of their game, the top of their industry, and it's really the fastest way to learn.
Yeah, for sure. And it sends a really valuable signal to your prospects and clients from the standpoint of education and trust building. Like I said, to me, it's a very, very clear decision on resource allocation that for a lot of companies needs to happen all the way at the C-level and the board level. It's to say, look, you know, we spent $10 million on paid or local currency equivalent on paid events last year, $1 million. We're going to look at, and we're going to figure out what the bottom 20% was, the ones where it's not even remotely close to our ideal client profile or our demographics of our prioritized buyer personas. And we're going to take that 200,000, 2 million or whatever it is, and we're going to hire content and events pods that build owned media as opposed to depending entirely on paid media. And that's something that PR professionals have known about for years. They just have conveniently forgot about it the last couple of years because it's financially convenient to ride where all the financial opportunity is. But there's a big difference between your ability to be highly specific to what matters to you with paid as opposed to earned media, as opposed to owned media. And in this particular industry, in data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, I think there's been a complete collapse between the difference between paid and earned, where most of earned that's actually happening is either paid in disguise, or the earned is being used as lead generation to sell paid to them later. So once you kind of realize that that's actually going on, if you just want to avoid the circus altogether, it's so much more effective to build your own little micro media brand that's specifically built for your most important buyer personas, one buyer persona at a time. And I would literally have a small pod of 2, 3, 4 people, and their entire job it is to create an amazing podcast, an amazing webinar program, and amazing in-person events that are specific to their extreme high value buyer personas. So let's say they're selling solar energy projects that are anywhere from 100,000 to $1 million plus in impact. The economic value of those are so large that once you narrow down your addressable market and your ideal client profile, and you know geographically where you're doing business with, let's say for argument's sake, there's 500 companies that are on that account list. I want to try to get as many of those 500 people as possible to appear as guests on the podcast, to be watching the podcast, to be watching clips from the podcast, attending webinars, attending in-person versions of webinars. Kind of the next level I see even beyond that is taking that professional development and wrapping it into academies, into formalized professional development programs, where after they go through your 4-part series or 6-part series or whatever it is, they can take a multiple choice exam and get a certificate and a PDF that they can brag about on their LinkedIn profile. And wow, does that start to spread your brand and elevate how you're perceived in the marketplace? And again, the comparative cost of doing this relative to 100% blind loyalty to the ecosystem is like night and day. There's a couple of other really interesting benefits as well for people that are into solar. Business travel and the business conference events. This is something you can validate pretty quickly by just having some conversations with ChatGPT and Copilot, are some of the biggest creators of carbon footprint on the planet. And we know this because in the early 2020s, there was a lot of bad, scary things going on. But one of the positive things that went on is pollution, like carbon production plummeted. And a lot of the reason it plummeted is leisure travel and business travel were down. So yeah, there's definitely some social responsibility, carbon sustainability footprint issues that come up with all of the travel, all of the stuff being shipped in and out. If you think about the gear, the equipment that's typically showcased at a big mission critical conference, we're not talking about just shipping like coffee mugs and LCD monitors in and out. The 18 wheelers, the trucks that are required to bring this equipment, it's massively expensive and a massive carbon footprint. It's another social impact issue that comes up as well. This is a bigger issue in the US, but I see it happening quite a bit as well. Is I'm a huge proponent of gender diversity and having equal opportunity all around for everyone in the industry. Some of my best mentors earlier on in my career in the 90s were women. So it's very sad for me to see that I feel like we've ended in this polarized world where women feel like they need to build a parallel industry and parallel ecosystem to get back on parity with where they feel women are so severely underrepresented in these jobs. There actually is something that could pretty quickly turn the tide in getting women into a lot more of these jobs. And that's the 50% travel requirement. And it isn't just affecting women. It's affecting anyone that has young school-age children, anyone that has elder care responsibilities. Having a job on a go-to-market team where your company is exhibiting at 25, 30 plus national or global events a year requires a 50% travel requirement. That pretty much excludes a huge percentage of especially parents with young school-age children, but there can be people in other situations as well who would be fantastic at hosting podcast interviews, webinars, virtual events, virtual summits, even in-person events that are run in your conference room or classroom in the facility you work at, but don't require that you live out of a suitcase for 26 to 30 weeks out of the year. So again, when you look at one thing that could pretty dramatically increase the amount of women that are participating in a lot of these jobs and parents in general. And I know in a lot of parts of the world, people aren't even supposed to ask about, like, do you have kids, your age of kids and everything. There's all kinds of EOE issues with even knowing that information from a human resources perspective. But purely from a practical perspective, we saw so many women have a lot of career success in the early 2020s when it was 100% remote. And then all of a sudden, their mandates for return to office are kind of forcing them out. And I see a lot of the same thing happening when companies are overly dependent on their go-to-market, requiring 25, 30 weeks a year or more of travel, when the same talent is being misused where they could run a phenomenally ROI positive type of playbook by running thought leadership, running podcasts, virtual summits, webinars, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, to get to the exact same people a lot more cost effectively. And it would also dramatically improve their access to different kinds of talent that right now is really getting pushed out. There's another, along the same lines, there's also another big movement to try to get a lot more young people into the data center industry, which is noble. And it makes a lot of sense, because if you go to conferences and you look around, you start to realize that, yeah, there's a big percentage of people in the room who are probably pretty close to retirement. The problem with putting all of the efforts into recruiting teenagers and young 20s into this industry, finance, CFOs and boards love it because it's inexpensive labor. You can pressure people into working 60, 70, 80 hours a week that aren't at the stage in their life where they have a lot of responsibilities, low cost source of labor. But I also see a lot of people that are mid-career in their 30s and 40s and 50s that are very much interested in continuing to work in this industry, that are being laid off and pushed aside and having difficulty getting their footing back in, because their employer wasn't proactive enough to say that, hey, in 3 to 6 months, we think your role is going to be winding down, but we think, given all of your experience and industry connections, we think you'd be fantastic pivoting into this. So if you're open to it, we have a plan with Google certificates, we have a plan with EPI, we have a plan with whoever, where if you're willing to nights and weekends go through 20, 30, 40 hours of certification training over the next 6 months and pass this credential, we think you'd be fantastic to move into this mid-level role in this client-facing responsibility. Yes, it's not going to be an account executive or an account manager anymore. It'll be something more like being a product manager or someone's involved in solutions engineering. If they thought more about that, so the industry is not only losing a lot of people with ridiculous travel requirements by over conference dependence, but they're also losing a lot of great people mid-career who end up leaving data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And some go work in SaaS, which tends to be a little more tolerant of digital virtual playbooks. Some go work in telecommunications. On the operator side, I see a lot of people that leave working for data center operators and go into real estate, and not industrial real estate, but more like commercial and residential real estate. So the net loss is pretty significant. Talent acquisition, HR, and recruiting is being very much disrupted as well, and will continue to be disrupted. But one of the overriding messages that I see from where I sit is a lot of talented people that are sitting on the job market for way too long, because employers aren't playing the long game on realizing the institutional knowledge that's walking out the door when these decisions are made rapidly, as opposed to with thinking it ahead with a 3 to 6 month time horizon where there's some adjustments that can be made.
And when we talk about the labor side of the data centers, how does that actually compare in terms of what's being addressed and what needs to be reskilled? Because there is a huge gap just in renewables as a whole for having the right people in the right places to work the right jobs. And despite the whole global economic turmoil that we've seen unfold this year, growth is still there, and it will be only accelerating because it's the cheapest source of energy. And we need to see some sort of bounce back, hopefully sooner than later. And what would be the solution or the right formulation of people of getting into renewables and also these new data center jobs that are quite technical as well?
So the challenge with all of this is, let's say you have someone that was a career account executive or an account manager, and with their on-target earnings, they were used to a certain income level. They may have to take a couple of interim steps backwards to get to the next level and sustain their career. And for some people, they're open to it. In some cases, they're less open to it. Hollywood it's a very serious subject, but Hollywood's kind of made light of this over the last several years as well. There was a movie 5, 6, 7 years ago with Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson, where they're, I guess, in their 30s, and they decide that they're going to be interns at Google. And then there was another movie with Robert De Niro where he's in his early 70s and he goes to be a 70-year-old intern.
Yeah, seen that.
It was with Anne Hathaway. Yeah, they're funny movies, but it's not funny for the impact of what people are going through with trying to figure out how to reinvent themselves. And I kind of look at, I think what's missing is a little bit of innovation. Is sales organizations are usually really, really good at figuring out like base plus bonuses, plus commission, plus overrides. I think there's some creativity for internal lateral moves of like, you're going to move into this position, and until you're fully ramped, yes, it's going to be at a lower compensation level, but we're going to play for all of your training. You're going to be able to keep all your health insurance. You're going to be able to keep your retirement and pension and everything intact. Your base is going to go down. But if you go through the training and the certification roadmap and you hit your KPIs within 12 months, 18 months, you'll be fully restored to and have additional opportunities beyond what you currently have. I think people are seeing that as a very taboo topic to bring up. But it's very similar to the idea of people got used to working from home. Should they be willing to accept a lower salary working from home as opposed to commuting into an office? I think there's a pretty strong argument for if you're not having to spend 40 hours a month commuting and you're not spending $1,000 or $2,000 a month on either public transportation or cars, and your cost of food and your cost of wardrobe and everything go down quite a bit, that your cost in being a remote employee is significantly lower than your cost of being in an office employer. So I think the same kind of logic of the differentials, and then now even in parts of the US, starting with certain states, then California and Colorado were leading the charge with this, with requiring transparency, where to post a job on a place like LinkedIn, you have to have a pay range, but they gave employers a lot of latitude for the pay ranges. So there's some employers that have narrow pay ranges, and those narrow pay ranges have a lot of credibility. The ones with pay ranges that are so broad have no credibility. But it's the same way as that, as it gets a little less taboo to talk about differentials geographically, like recognizing that it's way more expensive to live in London as opposed to living in Manchester, or to live in New York City as opposed to living in rural Wyoming or something like that. I think there needs to be recognition around differentials on cost of living, differentials of being hybrid in office 100% of the time, travel heavy 100% of the time. I think there also could be a logical progression of step-ins for career retraining, where it's a hit to income, but with a long-term 6 to 18-month perspective, the employer is investing in giving you space to reskill and giving you rotational opportunities throughout the company. I think of a company, I think it's Schneider Electric, where there's a number of roles, and for your first 9 months that you're in the company, they keep rotating you through a different department every 3 weeks and in a different physical location every 3 weeks. So like by the end of the rotation, you've gotten to experience like 8 or 10 different locations, 8 or 10 different departments, and you're ridiculously well-rounded. And the travel part of it may not be practical for everyone, but if you think about trying to reskill someone from being an account manager to working on as the communications person for a network operations center or cybersecurity team or something like that, like, yeah, these are very, very practical options. The challenge is the culture actually has to support this idea with flexibility. I remember early on in my career in the 90s, it was this rather innovative idea that you could have job sharing. And as you might expect with what I was talking about before, the job sharing was super popular among parents with young kids, where you had the super talented person and they got to the point where they were probably in their late 20s, early to mid 30s or something like that. And they decide they want to start a family and they want to take off a month or two for maternity leave. And then after that, they want to come back, and they know they can't go quite at the pace that they were going at before because there's other responsibilities, but they want to do meaningful work and they'd love to come back to their job, but they need to have someone that kind of shares that job. And in a hot labor market, employers, and in hot spaces where there's more demand for the skills and supply of the skills, employees have been receptive to those kinds of arrangements in the past. And I think, again, this is part of the flexibility of figuring this all out from a very practical standpoint. If I can motivate a couple hundred companies in this industry to look at the bottom 20% of their conferences that are basically just vanity metrics and paying for their employees to go on vacation, and take some of that investment and repurpose that into owned events, owned webinars, owned podcasts, breakfast seminars, not only will the ROI be so much better because it's so much more tightly targeted on their target account list and the perfect buyer personas and the perfect messaging, but it accomplishes a lot of social benefits as well, with continuing to keep crucial employees and not allowing that institutional knowledge to walk out the door for people where 50% travel requirement is just not practical.
Yeah, for sure. And where do you see the the whole data center industry being in terms of labor and workforce in the next 5 years? What will change?
It's interesting. I asked that exact question to everyone I interview on the podcast. And the way I usually phrase it is, how do you envision, when you look into your crystal ball, how do you envision the next 2 to 4 years shaping out for someone that's leading a company like yours, or leading marketing, or leading sales for a company like yours? And I get all different kinds of responses. I think there's going to be continued pressure across the board to try to invest in certain kinds of automation. I think in general, the more the company has been an incumbent, the more hundreds or thousands of employees are used to doing things a certain way. On the technology side, the more technical debt, or the HR, the cultural version of that, the harder it's going to be to drive that transformation. But I think there's going to be an increasing appetite for automation as much as possible. And with what we started talking about early on, a lot of this is going to be driven by improving the customer experience, the CX, improving the prospect experience, improving the channel partner experience, where no matter how motivated someone in a sales professional is to be on call and available for their prospects and clients nearly all waking hours, 5-6 days a week, at some point you max out or you burn people out if they have the on button on and they're responding to messages more than about 70 or 80 hours a week. And even the upper end of that range we know isn't sustainable. Well, there's 168 hours in those weeks, and your prospects and clients, you don't know when they're going to be doing their research. You may think that it's always in business hours, but no, people get to doing research on your category and most categories in the data center industry on when it's most convenient for them. And that could be 2 o'clock in the morning, their local time. They always say, like, what's keeping someone up at 2 a.m.? That, is a pretty big point of pain. They also could only have time to get their head above water and research this big initiative in a lull point over a holiday weekend. So like they're on your website and they're looking to learn about this stuff at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon when no one's going to be available for another 36 hours or whatever it is. So I think a lot of the building blocks were in place for that even in the 2010s. You started to see companies investing in more knowledge-based articles and support ticket deflection and self-guided onboarding and customer academies. I think all of that is going to be there and then some. But I think these trends where we're seeing a much more technical hire across most of the go-to-market team is going to continue to accelerate, because it's going to be very hard for client-facing team members to get the face time and the trust that they need from prospects and clients without this. So I think the nature of who is going to be hired is going to change quite a bit. I think over time, companies are going to wake up to the reality that if they can invest in professional development and motivate their employees to invest in professional development, it's not only good for employees, but it's good for the employer as well, because you don't have the downtime and the loss of the institutional knowledge and the competitive issues with all that knowledge walking out the door. So I think learning and development is going to continue to be a really big area, which is why it was so shocking to me earlier on in this year when I saw people in learning and development job titles actually leaving companies and not immediately announcing the next job that they were going to. So it's pretty obvious that it was financially motivated. So I think a lot of companies are struggling to connect the dots on the return on investment. But yeah, I think there's going to continue to be a lot more technical subject matter experts being hired into sales positions. I see across the board a lot more companies being very, very motivated to recruit and grow channel partner relationships. I think some try to do it a little bit too early and can end up causing reputational damage if they're really not truly ready. I think it's not originally a lot of the motivation sometimes is purely economic, is they're trying to take a fixed cost and turn it into a variable cost. But I think if you really just understand how fragmented markets are and getting access to all the nooks and crannies that wouldn't be cost effective for you to do internally, I think there's a lot to be said for most companies in this ecosystem having a secondary or tertiary buyer persona that's one or more different kinds of channel partners. And I think the nature of those channel partner relationships is entirely possible that they could be 2 or 3 distinct kinds of categories. So early on, it might be a single program, it might be a single landing page, but as companies grow, it's far more likely that they identify 2 or 3 different categories that need 2 or 3 different kinds of support, 2 or 3 different comp plans. Like in SaaS, it's kind of old news, but it's at least 5 years ago, they started to figure out that a lot of channel partners were either transacting or non-transacting. What that meant is transacting meant that they were closing a transaction and they were holding the piece of paper and they were able to clearly get sales compensation on it. But they also discovered that in addition to that one transacting partner who was closing the sale on the SaaS license, there were 5, 6, 7 other partners that were being hired by that client to help customize, support, train, expand APIs, migrations, monetization, whatever it is, who weren't having reselling revenue that couldn't be compensated that way. So organizations need to figure out another way to provide some benefits and incentives of support for different kinds of business models that are involved in those relationships. But yeah, I think channel partner ecosystems are going to continue to be a big deal. Marketplaces, we didn't talk about it all, but like even in your category, I just interviewed founders of an energy marketplace. So they'll be going live on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast in the next few weeks. And it's designed to, there's so much friction that goes into figuring out like who has utility grid capacity, who has the demand for this, standardizing nomenclature, trust, things that are super critical to making marketplaces happen. I think you're going to see increasing demand for that as well, as people throughout the data center ecosystem have already gotten very comfortable with marketplace transactions in other parts of their life, but in their professional life, it's been certainly lagging behind in power and energy. But I think that's about to be addressed in a pretty profound way. Change always takes time, but as we continue to have new people always entering the industry, you over time have fewer and fewer people complaining and whining that, but we've always done it that way. But yeah, well, when you get new entrants who don't have that objection because they haven't always done it that way and they're open to new ways that are far more efficient and save a ton of time and take a ton of cost out of it, then yeah, that opens up the opportunity for disruption and transformation.
Indeed, and we will see that disruption unfold in a faster and faster manner in the next couple of years. On that note, what type of people would you like to hear from? Who would you like to speak to, both on the podcast or the topics that you guys are covering with DCS?
I talk to people throughout the global data center ecosystem, from operators like colocation, hyperscale, modular wholesale data center providers, 22 different kinds of data center technology providers, a dozen or so different kinds of facilities related providers, construction, real estate investors, source sales and marketing. It's like 57 different business models that are in and around the data center ecosystem that we track at DCSMI. The ones that tend to be most open to using thought leadership as a strategic growth engine tend to either be data center operators, and in most cases, the data center operators that are invested in this have been, if they're just getting to this now in the 2020s, they're either brand new or they've been extraordinarily resistant in the past, but most have been running really, really good versions of these playbooks going back at least 10 years from the heyday of when marketing technology tools were starting to become more powerful and the content marketing movement started. Technology and facilities companies tend to be a lot more aggressive investors in this space. Construction and real estate tends to lag considerably in this space. But overall, one of my bigger predictions is, in the same way that everyone in a go-to-market capacity in this role needs to have a well-optimized, updated LinkedIn profile that shows that they're sharing useful content and best practices and information on a very regular basis. I think certainly by the end of this decade, the majority of the people that want to position themselves well, everyone's going to need to have something like exactly what we're doing. Everyone's going to need to have a podcast, a YouTube channel, be sharing useful video content, multimedia content on a very regular basis. And it's just a matter of how regular. If they have the resources, probably at least once a week or multiple times a week. If they're a smaller company and they're stretched a little thin, at least a couple times a month. But yeah, that's a huge, huge part of being able to control their narrative. And when I see people getting upset that mainstream media isn't portraying their company or their slice of the segment in the way they'd like to be, my answer is, you don't have to be the only one that's blogging about this topic or creating videos about this topic or podcasts about this topic. The barriers to entry are not especially high. However, the barriers to attention, you have to provide a lot of value. You have to know exactly who you're creating this for, what's going on in their world, being client-centric and looking a lot more like a teacher and a consultant and a lot less like a vendor or salesperson. So yeah, we work with people throughout the global data center ecosystem, operators, technology and facilities, construction, real estate, investment, outsourced sales and marketing companies globally, based in the United States, in Florida, about an hour north of Miami. But I talk with people every week from not only all over the the Americas, but throughout EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I usually even have a couple of time slots available on my late evenings, 1 or 2 days a week for people that are in Asia Pacific, that are in Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the evening, my time is in the morning, their time. So yeah, it truly is a globally connected ecosystem. And most of the people that I tend to speak with are sales and marketing and product professionals, channel partner professionals. Usually when I'm speaking with executives at the C-level, they tend to be from smaller companies, and enterprise companies, usually the best point of contact, either as a client or on the podcast, is someone that's like in a divisional director, regional VP level for a certain product line in and around a certain region. So kind of exactly what you'd expect to be the internal champion of someone that has a couple dozen or a couple hundred people in their division or their subsidiary for that unit, that particular business unit within the ecosystem. But yeah, it's super for your category, especially where we're talking about alternate energy. It's really, for a lot of companies that are early on, one of the biggest battles they need to figure out is getting to product market fit, knowing who the right companies are, who the right stakeholders are. And a lot of what you're doing in that first year or two, as you're simultaneously building out R&D, is running a lot of experiments on who's the most interested in hearing about what you're working on. But even earlier than that, most of the time, the best entree isn't just going to come from personal recommendations. It's going to be from people learning from you about topics that are hyper relevant to what they're doing, and using that as the best foot in the door and the best entree that positions you as an expert, as opposed to just another person that's pushing a product.
And what would be the right way to get in touch with you on any of those topics that you mentioned?
I'm super active on LinkedIn. So if anyone that's interested can reach out on LinkedIn, Joshua Feinberg, Feinberg. Just mention that you watch the podcast, listen to the podcast on Soliverse, so you can connect with me there. You can follow DCSMI on LinkedIn. You can follow the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast LinkedIn company page as well. And we also publish a email newsletter each Sunday. It comes directly to your email box. You can subscribe for free to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter at www.dcsmi.com.
Cool. We'll make sure to link to all of those in the show notes below. And Joshua, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's been a pleasure. Really, really appreciate it.